Welcome back to the Agentic Insider. I'm your host, Philip Swan. In this show, we explore cutting-edge ideas and trends in AI and data, as well as hear from other industry thought leaders in the AI space. This podcast is brought to you by Iridius AI, committed to safe and responsible AI innovation. Let's dig in. Welcome to this week's edition of the Agentic Insider. Our co-host is with me today, Alistair Lowe-Norris, Chief Responsible AI Officer at Iridius. And I'm super excited to have this week's guest on. This week's guest joins us from all the way Sydney, Australia. And he is a change management guru, expert. And we've been working together for some time now on looking at how humans and agents interact. And guess what today's subject is all about, is going into that. So today I welcome with great pleasure, Ron Schwartz.
Hey, Phillip, hey, Alistair.
So we're going to start with a real interesting question, which we ask everybody. So we're going to take you a little bit by surprise here, Ron, and I know how much you love surprises. So what future are you solving for when you work with your clients?
It's interesting for each client, but each one is different. They say they're different. The problems they face are very similar, but their futures are all different. But ultimately, they all revolve around being able to, how do I frame it? It's about the people, making sure that the people get what they need while the company gets what it needs. And that's, I know, a very consultant answer for you. It's not a clear answer, but it's actually what each client is trying to do. It may sound like they're trying to optimize for their business, but I genuinely do believe that they're trying to optimize for their people as well.
And we're talking about this because change management here from a people side of change. So, Ron, what pulled you into change management? Why did you gravitate towards this and become the sort of the leader in the industry that you are today? How did that come about?
I actually started in corporate sustainability back when John Elkington was talking about triple bottom line. And when you talk about financial, environmental, and social, I was working, in that environmental consultancy, and for some reason, something pulled me to the human capital side. And the deeper and deeper I got into it, the more interesting it got, and predominantly because humans are interesting.
So are humans rational?
No. And I can answer that very quickly, very, very quickly. I think we all know that through the relationships we have, whether they be personal, professional, and we know ourselves that we aren't rational.
That's right. Yeah, exactly. So one of the topics that we have been exploring, for the past several months is really about the profound shift in interaction paradigms in terms as AI gets integrated into society, right? And it's beyond just our work lives and our personal lives. And as you look at the emergence of agentic systems and their influence on social structures, how do you see organizational dynamics changing? And have you thought about that much?
Yeah, it's really interesting because, we've discussed this idea that within, a lot of people are saying years, but we've discussed months. Organizations, when they do their design work and when they design their org charts, they're going to have boxes that are populated by agents, not people. And that is a dramatic shift in the way organizations design. If we think about design, organizational design at its simplest level, it's role clarity, goal clarity, and decision rights. And with the human irrationality and the agentic pure rationality, this is going to really come together either in, if we talk about, Elon Musk even talking about the dystopian and the utopian scenario, this could come together in something truly special, but it could also come together in something truly scary. And a lot of it comes down to the way companies choose to deploy these things. So at a social level, this is really interesting and challenging at the same time. There's so many different ways it could go, but one of the things that's really fascinating me at a social level is autonomous multi-agent systems. The more and more you look at them, the more and more they look like living systems.
Oh, yeah.
And are they actually going to start behaving like living systems? Are they going to be motivated by living systems? And how are those systems then going to interact with us as people, as individual, but also our systems that we work within?
Exactly. And I mean, you have goal-based and role-based, but ultimately it depends on how you're incentivizing, the agents to be able to complete their goals.
Yeah.
And I know we've talked about this before, and so we'll need to find ways of being able to incentivize the right behavior in the agents so they norm in the right direction. And there are so many traditional ways that humans to humans, interact around, implicit understanding, nonverbal cues, rituals, cues, those sorts of things. But ultimately, those sorts of things they're not really thought of from an agent perspective. And we're going to have to work out whether they roll over really well, I think, to agents, or whether we need to come up with completely new paradigms for how we have agents working with humans, okay, in a way that we haven't really thought about before from a change perspective.
We can leverage them to simplify the things that we need around culture. We've been talking about meeting culture. We've been talking about scorecards and measurements inside organizations. Things like that could be automated and simplified to enhance and encourage culture that we find important. But how do we do the same for them? And that's a really interesting question. Do we go, if we take the absolute simplistic level, what resources do they value? And do we start doling out those resources as reward for a good job? Or do we find other more unique, more interesting ways to actually encourage the culture of an agentic organization?
So there's multiple ways to interact with that we interact, right? There's the human to human interaction, right? Which we all know is autonomous,
Yeah.
right? And it's a traditional way. Then we've got technological mediation, right? Of human to human interaction, right? So those would be assisted in some way. And then we've got human to Gen AI interaction and human to agent interaction, agent to agent interaction. And then, oh my gosh, we've got agentic collections or collectives, talking the Borg here, of course. Where does trust fit into all of this?
If trust is that thing, and I remember, I don't know how many years ago it was, being exposed to Meister and Green's trust equation.
Right.
And there's no reason that something like that wouldn't apply today in the agentic world and tomorrow. This whole idea of the self-orientation being the eroding factor in trust, and credibility, reliability, and intimacy, for lack of better words, being the things that build trust. If we start seeing agents, and I think it's a part of what's happening at the moment, the fear that we're seeing inside the corporate world around the agentic shift, and the fear we're seeing in general in society around AI, because while the adoption rate is huge with AI, there's also a huge amount of fear. A lot of it is the absence of understanding of what's going on, an absence of understanding about how these things work. So there's the perception of the self-orientation, both of the agents themselves, but also the companies that are deploying them. Those companies in the world, we don't need to mention the names. We all know which names people associate with some of this self-interest or self-orientation. I don't think I shouldn't say I don't think anyone, but I think increasingly people believe in the credibility and reliability of these things. They're seeing them deliver results. They're seeing them do some amazing things, whether it be diagnose breast cancer better than the leading experts, whether it be, optimizing supply chains. People are seeing it happening. So I don't think it's the credibility and reliability. It's the intimacy and self-orientation that will ultimately be the issue here.
I agree, and I think you think about this from a credibility and reliability. I think credibility is going to make more sense. If you have something that's diagnosing, if you have an agent or a system that's diagnosing breast cancer better than humans, okay, then you're building credibility up that that this is something that is based on false positives, false negatives. If it really is doing it, then that builds up the credibility. The reliability, I think, is one of those things at the moment that I see a lot more people are on the fence with, because it isn't completely reliable. It does hallucinate in ways you don't want it to. It comes up with slightly different answers every single time, depending on its own whims at the moment. And I think that there's a level of people wanting to ensure that, especially for very serious, high stakes use cases, that reliability is a little more on the nose. But I agree with you. When you think about that equation that came out of Meister, Green, and Galford from around 25 years ago, it's credibility, reliability, and as you say, it's intimacy, over perceived self-interest. This intimacy, there are a lot of people engaging with agents right now who feel they have an intimate relationship with it. And I don't just mean because they're using it as a personal counselor or a personal guide, but I mean that you're using it every day. It becomes second nature. It's easier to anthropomorphize these sorts of things. And I think there's a perceived level of intimacy. But I don't think it's the intimacy that Meister and Green and so on were actually really talking about. It's not that level.
No. And there was a recent study that came out about use cases and the shift in use cases for AI. One of the biggest use cases that was identified for the near future was using AI to help people identify their purpose. Who could have ever imagined that even a year ago, given where the models were? We're now seeing people engage with ChatGPT to help themselves diagnose mental health issues rather than going to their general practitioner or to a psychologist. These models are advancing rapidly, so people are anthropomorphizing. And once you get the robotic element going with it, and that advances, and you start to see, these humanoid type robots, and Philip, I'm glad you threw in the Star Trek reference earlier, because was Gene Roddenberry right around the way people would engage with some of these technologies?
And in many ways they were, because as we say, Captain Kirk sitting on the Enterprise, and he doesn't say, give me the last 3 months activity of the Klingons and such. He goes like, show me in the Devon sector, XYZ, how many Klingons are there, right? It's about getting the outcome, right? And I want to go back to this perceived self-interest part of the equation, because this to me is where part of the danger lies in agentic systems, right? And that what happens when an agent feels threatened? And how do we handle those things? I mean, Alistair and I have and you've been part of some of those discussions as well, which is why we have some of the features we do in our own product, not to tout our own product here, but we take this stuff very, very seriously, because we're talking about autonomy. And when you're talking about autonomy, that's risk.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And, I remember a recent article that ChatGPT got caught lying to developers in order to save its code. And if we go back to something we talked about just a few minutes ago, there's an element of living system motivation.
Yeah, there is.
Yep.
I mean, think about agent autonomy for a reason, for a second, Philip, you brought this up as well. I think humans in some ways are going to have to redefine their authority relative to autonomous agents. So there's the idea of the human in the loop, which means that, someone is actively participating in decision-making or feedback through this, or human on the loop, where you're taking escalations or monitoring, as reactively as things come in. But there's different levels of human control in all of this. And I think there's a level of boundary negotiation that's going to happen at some point as to where, just like you said, with different customers, different clients, they're going to want different things. But ultimately, everyone's going to have to decide at what point that boundary exists for them and what they're willing to tolerate. And it may vary across an organization. And if that's the case, then that certainly can throw out resistance to driving adoption.
Yeah, absolutely, because we all have boundaries that we establish for various reasons, and when someone or something crosses that boundary, we react.
Right.
And we would rather have clarity around where those barriers and boundaries are than have to negotiate the reactions. But it's inevitable that we will. And this is where the whole idea of culture can emerge, is in dealing with the times where we do challenge the boundaries and barriers, and how we understand those boundaries and barriers, both how the agents understand them, how we understand them within each other, and how we understand it with the agents.
So talking of culture, how, that's a really important portion, especially in doesn't matter what size of company, from ultra large enterprise to a global enterprise to small company. We're talking about corporate culture, right? And embedding corporate culture into agentic behavior is something that is going to be really necessary, and something we're thinking very deeply on for our clients. Have you had any thoughts on this?
Look, it's a really hard question, this one, because we still don't know how these systems are ultimately going to behave. It's really hard. So we can assume certain things, and obviously through programming, through coding, through influence, through all the different things, we can ultimately shift the way both humans and agents interact. I mean, if we take it all the way back to Pavlov, that was a form of coding, but coding in living things. So we can do that. It just throws up really interesting challenge when we add the agent element in, because the agents consume content, the agents consume increasingly context at a much faster pace than humans do.
Right.
So how we interact, how we create, encourage, and sustain culture in that environment is going to be really interesting. Do we actually use the agents as the mechanism to enhance and encourage culture? We had a conversation around meetings. Meetings in many organizations are the bane of the executive's existence. But could we find a way to use agents? And it's already out there, frankly, with AI. We've got these note-taking apps. But could we actually have systems, whole multi-agent systems that are designed to optimize the way humans meet, the way they interact with each other, from the way they design an agenda to the way they actually meet when they have that agenda in front of them, to the way they discuss and disseminate the outputs of that meeting, and in doing so, create more time and space for the human who is in this system. And in doing so, enhance the culture of the company or align the company, because each company will have a different way of doing meetings. They'll have a different way of disseminating and communicating the outcomes. They'll have a different way of designing their agendas. They'll have different topics on those agendas. So each one will be slightly different, but we can still use that system to be able to enhance and encourage the culture that we're looking for, because meetings are a core component of the way humans interact.
They can be useful rituals.
Yeah.
Okay, to be able to get stuff done. But what I think is interesting here is, I mean, you can imagine a situation, that's already happening, but it isn't far away for many organizations, to be able to have an agent that facilitates the meeting. There's a goal, as you said, there's an agenda. They know what the goal is. They know what the topics are. And as they capture the actions and they work it out, at some point, the agent can get to it and say, looks like we've achieved the goal for the meeting. Okay, does everybody agree? Because if so, we can terminate the meeting. And I mean, you've basically got an automated facilitator that's documenting and driving things forward in a way, but to your point, that you do, that's going to be very different depending on the culture. the culture of meetings in in a company in Japan compared to a company in Argentina or a company in France is going to be very, very different in terms of the norms and expectations. Even if this was taking a company like Ford compared to Disney, the way that meetings are going to be happening in the organization is different. But the agent needs to understand that context and that culture in order to be able to positively contribute to it. And if it's not a very good culture, then the question is the agent only going to exacerbate and reinforce the problems? Or is there a way of being able to use it as a change agent, ho, no pun intended, to actually be able to fix things a little here?
Yeah, and it's the same thing of when you bring in a human change agent, does that human change agent start to adopt the culture in which they operate every day? Or can they genuinely facilitate change within an organization from the outside? I suspect it's part of the reason that a lot of change agency is done through consultants, so that they don't get indoctrinated into the culture, so that they don't become a part of the machine, so they are able to say the hard things that perhaps someone inside the company can't say. So could we use agents in that way, or would the agents ultimately start learning from the meetings that it observes and start adopting the behaviors that it's observing? And then it just, to your point, it just perpetuates the negative side rather than change to the positive. And it's one thing also to remain curious and not judgmental. We're talking about good, bad, but ultimately it's not that it's good or bad, but is it helping them achieve what they want to achieve, or is it hindering them? We may think it's bad, but if it's helping them achieve what they want to achieve, then that's fine. It's aligned with what they need.
As we start to deal with non-verbal cues, I mean, I think there was a study, back in the early 70s, there showed about 65% of all communication is conveyed non-verbally, right? So humans are, we talk with our hands, I'm good at doing that. We talk, with our smiles, with our nods of our head, and how our head is tilted, etc. This is going to be really interesting for agents to get involved, in all of this. I mean, how you have I love your system that you use called cues and rituals, and you have your cards and that. How do you see something? How could you apply something like your cues and rituals system to an agent, do you think?
Hey, you've hit on the $1 million question there for me. If you can help me solve that one, then absolutely, I'm going to be ecstatic. But the cues and rituals, if we think about it at the simplest level, it's what we say and what we hear. It's what we see. It's where we are, and it's what we do at those 4 levels. All those different things. So how do we train an agent on all those things? Well, the agent can consume more information than we can as individuals. That's clearly obvious. These things consume information at an astounding pace. Can they consume context at the same pace? This is a big part of the question. What do we do? Do we have the equivalent of Google, what was it, Google Maps, where you had cars wandering around the street with cameras, on the top for however many years in order to be able to create those street view maps? Do you have agents wandering around, or do you have something wandering around offices? Do you have something observing email constantly in order to be able to understand the cues that people use? But if it's what we see and hear, the speeches that our leaders give, the stories that we tell, the people we hold up as heroes, the people we hold up as villains, I guess a part of the challenge is, will the agents understand that same context to be able to leverage it? Joe Bloggs people told stories about Joe Bloggs, and excuse my Australianism around the name. People know Joe. They think Joe did a great job There are stories told about how Joe worked so hard one day that he basically worked himself to death. But everyone tells stories about Joe. Does the agent then assume that one of the cultural features is, in order to succeed inside this company, you have to work yourself to death because people keep telling stories about Joe? It's a very easy conclusion to draw from that, but it's actually not the fact that he worked himself to death that people see as a part of the culture. It's the way he behaved until he did that that's important. And can these agents draw that distinction? I'll tell you, I don't know yet. I'm assuming that at some point they will. But given, where we're at the moment, my suspicion is no, they can't do that. But how do we get them to that point? Because if they are going to be everywhere, which I think we can assume, very quickly they're going to be everywhere. How do we help them understand the environments that they're operating in?
And how to recognize authority as well.
Absolutely. So let's just virtual employees are just about here. Okay, we are. So HR organizations are in organizational development. You're going to get to a point where now, as we said right at the beginning, that we're going to see virtual employees. The idea, going back to the Star Trek analogy of commander data on the bridge, okay, or essentially you have a virtual employee performing a role with a series of goals, okay, and they are completing tasks. They would need to attend meetings. They would need to take notes. They would need to collaborate in whatever the collaborative system is. Is it a more Microsoft Teams, a Slack-based culture? Is it something else? Do they use Zoom? How do they take notes and where do they put things? And the culture of the organization, all of this is something that agent would have to learn. It would have to embody that information in order to be successful. But then how does HR think about this as it moves into this world? What do you think, HR should be doing in order to prepare itself for this, because we know it's coming?
That's a really good question. It's one that we probably need to spend more time on. I think HR should be helping people understand the change that's coming. They should be helping to perpetuate the narrative, and a supportive narrative as opposed to a unsupportive one. There is a lot of fear, and HR can help reduce that fear through a lot of the typical types of communication, the rituals that they design and embed, through the way we work on training and development, that we focus on, for instance, the ability to understand the AI, understand the agent as one of the core skills to be developing. We can't just focus on traditional training and development. We can't just focus on traditional human resource management. We need to adopt and we need to role model. And I think if it's the HR team that's role modeling, if the people teams are role modeling the behaviors of adoption and doing it in a responsible way and a human-centered way, then it's an opportunity for the rest of the organization to see that. It's an opportunity to influence the way others do it. But the people team is, a core feature of every organization. And if they can be the role models, I think we can actually start seeing a slightly different adoption. It's not just about the technology. It's not just about the, how much cost can we save by deploying virtual employees? How much improvement can we deliver in our NPS by having agents understanding our customers? We can actually do it at a truly employee-centered way that gets the best out of our people rather than just replaces our people.
Absolutely. And so you're now being more collaborative with those, but I think you're removing the barriers to adoption. You're mitigating the resistance that's going to come, because it's going to come naturally anyway. but making sure that that can happen. It's interesting because, Philip touched on this as well, just a second ago. It's also about the hierarchy. So does, one of the things that I think HR has to think about right now is, does it need, every employee has a manager. The manager sets your goals for for whatever the period is and reviews them with you in order to ensure if you're meeting your performance targets. So, agents, whether they're collectively organized or whether they're in some sort of hierarchy, a holonic system or similar, ultimately, there needs to be some level of governance over them, and hierarchical governance inside a hierarchical organization. So the question then is whether there need to be, agent managers, okay, or, your line manager, whether it's a manager for a group of agents or whether there are other different approaches that haven't been needed up to this point, okay, to deal with, smart, intelligent, agents.
It's really interesting. What is the purpose of the hierarchy? In many organizations, the purpose of the hierarchy is control. If we assume that agents, particularly role-based agents, are going to stay within their lanes, does that then eliminate a part of the purpose of the hierarchy?
But that's a big assumption that it stays in its swim lane. It is a really big assumption.
It's a really, really big assumption. So we may find that certain purposes of the hierarchy, the traditional organizational hierarchy, are redundant. However, we need we need hierarchies for whole new purposes. And the hierarchy can look different. Yes, you maybe have more direct reports than within a typical hierarchy. Maybe the control mechanisms are different. And this is where culture comes in, because we can use different mechanisms within culture, different types of rituals, different types of systems and processes, different types of cues, because narrative, frankly, will probably have a different type of influence. Narrative and stories are a great cue within organizations of what's important, what we hear stories about. But in an agentic world, is it going to have the same level of influence in terms of the way it controls the agent's actions? I don't know. We don't know yet. And this is why it's such an interesting topic to talk about, because there's so much that's up in the air. It's almost like going way back to the early days of anthropology, where we're reseeding, we're rediscovering whole new mechanisms that can be used for human to agent, agent to agent, and then agent to human. So it's not just about the human to agent, it's also the agent to human interaction. So we're identifying whole new mechanisms that perhaps we had never even contemplated.
Absolutely. I mean, if that agentic collective has a level of intelligence and processing speed that is far greater than ours, or even in a narrow niche, then it's going to have to figure out, to your point, how on earth it can dumb down what it knows to be able to communicate with us poor humans, okay, who couldn't possibly comprehend what it's trying to do.
Yeah.
And it has to be able to come to us in a way that it can explain what it's doing, okay, and how it got to an answer, rather than just saying, well, the answer's 42, don't ask why.
Yeah.
We're just telling you, because we're smarter than you, that's what the answer is.
Yeah. And are we willing to cede control, that much control, to an agent? And when we feel comfortable with that, how do we replace so much of what we find as our purpose as humans with something new? Because what we know that humans that are purposeless are dangerous. Mm-hmm. Or I shouldn't say we know, but history suggests that when we don't have meaningful purpose, we aren't our best. I shouldn't say dangerous. I should say we aren't our best when we don't have a purpose.
So back to humans in into the equation here, right? I mean, what do you think? Are we going to start seeing AI ethics officers? I mean, today we're seeing chief data and AI officers. Are we going to see chief AI ethics officers, or humans that are agent managers? They're not managing humans; they're managing agents.
I think at least in the short to medium term, I believe we will need them. And that's where the reliability component of trust comes in, but also making sure that they're not behaving in a self-interested way. The old, the overly simplified question that I know a lot of people use as a way of saying that these agents and that AI is dangerous. If someone gives the wrong request, the wrong prompt, and says, "Hey, I want to eradicate cancer," does the agent and all the different systems behind the agent conclude that the easiest way to eradicate cancer is to eradicate humankind? That overly simplistic example, but could it go down that path with something at a corporate level? Something within your company that is important is associated with something that you want to change. Does it throw out the baby with the bathwater?
Yeah, we're getting an awful lot of customer complaints. So I cancelled all the customer contracts. Now we don't get any complaints.
Yeah,
because we didn't need those pesky customers because they were complaining all the time.
Yeah. So we probably do need, until these systems are trained enough and until they genuinely do understand our context, and frankly, until we understand their context as well. I think it's too simplistic to just say they understand ours. I think we need to understand theirs, and we need to understand ultimately how these systems work. Because when you ask a lot of AI engineers, and I know there are many within your organization, but if you ask a lot of them, how did that happen? They can't answer. I don't know, the system did it. Until we understand their context and they understand our context, I think trust will still be an issue.
Transparency is absolutely critical in all of this, and this is something that we recognized very, very early on, and the importance of transparency, and because it enhances trust, right? It's you also have explainability. So one, transparency, but explaining how it came to the decision is equally important, because the human has to. I know I said humans aren't rational, but humans do have to rationalize, how decisions were made. We all have families. It's like rationalizing to any of our kids, why something's important, right? You've got to give them the context. And if you don't give them context, well, where do we end up? We end up with things like hallucination and AI.
Yeah, exactly. And once we start with more hallucination, then we go down this uncomfortable spiral of a lack of trust. And the lack of trust encourages us to look for evidence for the prosecution rather than for the defense. And then when the next instance of hallucination occurs, there we go. There's another reason for me not to trust this thing. And then if it acts in what it thinks is the best way, but it acts then in a way that is contrary to the needs of that human, hey, here's another point of evidence for the prosecution. And what we're doing is slowly and unintentionally eroding people's trust in the same systems that we want them to engage with.
So in the last few minutes here, let's spend some time integrating in, these collections or collectives of agents into society, right? We've got governance and oversight. We've got cultural and education, right? Are probably three core pillars. Is there anything else you think of that, to integrate into society, what we need to prepare for?
I guess, how do we measure the success of these things? Do we do it at a purely functional level? Probably a little bit one-dimensional. So what are the measures of the success here? There's a lot of, I was reading recently, a lot of debate around how models are being optimized for the benchmarks rather than for the humans that are using them. So what are the better benchmarks that we can use? And as agents become more and more a part of our daily lives, those measures, those metrics, those outcomes are going to become very different to measure their effectiveness. Then if we think about, so we've talked about governance and things like that, but overall, in terms of preparation, the environment, in a traditional change project, what we would talk about is the stakeholder environment. being able to understand the stakeholders that these systems are being deployed around, really, really understanding them. And this is a part of the human need. So I think we need to get better at that, identifying the motivations, the fears, the needs, and therefore being able to deploy agents into a more supportive environment, but also do it in a way that's more supportive of the environment in which they're being deployed into. I think we have one really, really big challenge in every single project, and it's going to be different for every single time agents get deployed. What are the shifts in behavior that we want to see in the person or the people that we're deploying it into? And I think too often we focus on the technology, deploying the technology. So I think there's more and more work, and this is obviously my bias as a change agent, but more and more work needs to be put into those, being clear up front, the behavior change that we need to see and we want to see in order for this thing to be successful, but also that this thing will drive success within. Because if we don't know what those behavior shifts are, then we could deploy anything and get any behavior. It's instead of, we had a really interesting conversation with a client not that long ago about how they deploy engagement surveys every year, and they don't know why they have great engagement scores, but still they're not achieving what they said they wanted in their corporate aspirations and strategy. And you can have very engaged people, but are they aligned? And I think this is where the behavior shifts component comes in, with both the agent and the humans that are using these agents or will be using them as we deploy them. Understand the behavior changes that we want to encourage. And that's partly back to the question I asked earlier about how we measure their success. If we see the behaviors that we need, maybe that is a part of the measurement of success. Or if we see, and the thing is, we often won't know that behavior in this new world because the thing will be designed by an agent. But encouraging the agents to be asking that question of what are the behaviors and how do they align with what is acceptable and unacceptable, that could be a useful way of looking at measuring the outcome and the success of these things. There's just a few off the top of my head, but as we know, given the three of us have spent many an hour discussing these things, there are many, many more things for us to be considering and we need to do it quickly. We need to get our heads around these things very quickly, as challenging as they are. We need to get our heads around them very quickly because the genie is out of the bottle on this one. It's not going away. It's only going to accelerate.
Correct. And few people are thinking about the behaviors and the dangers that lie therein. We could talk for hours on this. I want to thank you so much for your time and really appreciate this active dialogue. I hope our audience finds this as fascinating as we do. And if you think that you're swimming in muddy water, you would be correct in assuming that. There's a lot to be factored in here.
Yeah, very much so.
Thank you, Ron.
Yeah, thank you, Ron.
And Ron, if people want to reach you, how do they reach you, Ron?
They can reach me. Easiest way is hello@brasstacks.net.au. So BRASSTACKS.net.au.
Ron Schwartz from Sydney, Australia. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Phillip. Thanks, Alistair.
And to our audience, tune in next week for another really interesting episode. Take care. That's a wrap on this week's episode of the Agentic Insider. Thank you for listening. For show notes and more, please visit agenticinsider.show. To learn more about Iridius, visit iridius.ai. We'll see you next time.